We are on Daf. Today's Daf is Ayin Aleph, and we are in just at the beginning of Daf Ayin Aleph. The discussion that the Gemara is having is a question of what happens if a property becomes the property owner dies, and the heir to that property who inherits that property on Shabbos, can they relinquish the rights on Shabbos or not? And the Gemara brought a case, a brisa, of a ger who has no heirs, halachic heirs, and dies on Shabbos. And the question is, that property that, well, it does say he dies on Shabbos. The question is when he died. But he died, he was in a property together with another Jew, and he dies, and that Jew can inherit that land, and essentially acquire that land, on account of that there's no direct heir. And so it's ownerless at this point. But somebody else came and made a chazaka. So if somebody else made a chazaka, meaning a form of acquisition of that land, they essentially become the heir to that property on Shabbos, and that would prohibit it. So the first case said, even though that somebody else acquired it, it becomes prohibited. And the Gemara says, what are you talking about? Even though someone else made a chazaka and acquired it, they prohibit it. It's because of somebody else acquiring it, they prohibit it. To which the Gemara said, now, what it means is that even though that the person did not acquire it on Shabbos, prior to Shabbos, rather they acquired it on Shabbos, so that at the onset of Shabbos, this person was the only, the surviving Jew was the only person in this property, because his partner here, who was living in the next unit, was deceased. Nevertheless, since he could have and didn't make an acquisition of the deceased ger's property, and somebody else could come and make that acquisition, so the other property is still independent of him. So there's himself and a freestanding property that somebody, himself or someone else, can acquire, and therefore, even though that the other person who made chazaka made it on Shabbos, is going to nevertheless become retroactively, essentially, someone else's property, and there are two entities in this courtyard, and therefore he cannot carry. The second case said, if mishech hashecha, if the Eruv took effect because they both were alive at the onset of Shabbos, and then after the sun set, that's when the ger passed away. Even though nobody else acquired, it does not prohibit. The Gemara says, what do you mean, even though no one else acquired? Even if someone acquired, or because no one else acquired, that's why it'll be a good Eruv, because there's no other entity here. And that's where we're up to. Right? That's the second line in the brisa. And if somebody else did, then for sure it would not prohibit. Adarabah, quite the contrary. When he made a chazaka, when somebody else acquired that space, it should be prohibited, because you now have two entities in the courtyard. You're right. It means even though that someone else acquired, it will not prohibit. But again, that's not what the brisa says. It says even though no one else acquired that ownerless property. What it means is this: even though that somebody did acquire it, but they made a chazaka on it after night fell, after Shabbos came in, since at the onset of Shabbos no one else could acquire it because the ger was still alive. And therefore, even though that somebody else acquired, it's as if there's no way to acquire this prior to Shabbos. Well, there wasn't a way to acquire it prior to Shabbos. So it's as if there's no way to acquire this and create a second entity here, and it will not prohibit it. Now, all of this brisa was brought to address the first line. The first line says that even though that somebody else acquired the land on Shabbos, it's going to prohibit it. And which we explained to mean because someone else acquired it, even though they didn't acquire it until in Shabbos, but they could have acquired it before Shabbos because the ger is deceased prior to Shabbos, and therefore, therefore, it prohibits carrying in the courtyard. So you see that an heir cannot relinquish rights because otherwise this fellow should relinquish his rights and it'll all be okay. In the first line, it says that he prohibits. Why don't we say that he could just relinquish the rights to the rest of the courtyard to the other person and it'll be fine? So the Gemara says, you're right. Yeah, the first answer, the Gemara says, yeah, who tells you we're talking about that he relinquished rights and it didn't work? Maybe it just says we need him to relinquish rights because otherwise it would prohibit. However, Rabbi Yochanan says these halachas that said that the talk about a yoresh and an heir relinquishing rights or not, it's all talking about the opinion of Beis Shammai, who we saw in the Mishnah says that the relinquishment of rights has to happen prior to the onset of Shabbos. And over here, this is happening on Shabbos, and therefore it won't work. The Amma aim bittul reshus b'Shabbos. You cannot relinquish rights on Shabbos. The Tanah we learned me'im asaynas reshus. When can you relinquish your rights in a courtyard? B'Shabbos yomrim b'boid yom, b'seloim mishatech. B'Shabbos it has to be done prior to Shabbos, and b'seil say it can be done even when it becomes dark, meaning on Shabbos. Amar Ula, my time at the Beis Hillel. What's the basis reasoning of Beis Hillel that you're allowed to do such a relinquishment of rights in the courtyard on Shabbos? So the Gemara says, Nasaka Emer Klach Etzel Yafos. So Ula explains this based on a halacha, an interesting halacha in Teruma. If somebody goes ahead, you have a silo full of produce that you just harvest, you brought it in, you have something, and somebody comes and on your behalf, but without your permission, goes ahead and takes teruma from your produce. Now, if they did so, we look at your response. And this fellow, the landowner, responds to the person who went ahead and took teruma for him without his permission. He said, "Why don't you go to the better produce that I have out there? There's better stuff." So we look at it and see, is he being sarcastic in saying, "Why don't you go to the best stuff I have?" Meaning, why'd you take the best stuff for teruma? So if there's nothing better, so then we know he's being sarcastic, and he was frustrated that he did the teruma this way, and it becomes invalid. However, if he says, "Why don't you go to the better stuff?" and we see that he does have better stuff, so then it's not to be taken sarcastic, it's to be taken seriously. He says, "Thank you so much for what you did, but I have even better teruma, better produce that I would want to give to teruma." So,
but I would think that it's a sugi in mizakin la'adam shelo b'fanav or not.
It's a question in shalichus of whether or not you can do something on behalf of someone else.
Because in the case that that's not what he wanted. In the case that's not what he wanted, then he's having the dam shelo b'fanav, and it's not a shlichus, right? So he didn't do anything. He didn't take.
There has to be a damage. There has to be damage. The fact that there's no damage to what he did. It's just his better stuff, and he would have wanted to give better. So in any case, it shows that he retroactively was happy with the teruma and him acting as his proxy, as his power of attorney. And so even though he never said so, it works. So too over here in the heir's case, it's similar. So too in the fellow who does relinquish his rights at the on Shabbos. Ula says, you know why it works? Because really it's not working on Shabbos. It's working before Shabbos. He's showing retroactively he wants to be a part of the Eruvin, and since he can't, he wants to relinquish and for them to all have the rights to his courtyard prior to Shabbos. So this is sort of like a retroactive relinquishment, and that's why it can be done on Shabbos. However, I'm Abaye. So Abaye says that would only work when he himself had the ability to do so at the onset of Shabbos. But in the cases that we're talking about, where Meis Nachri, a non-Jew, died in the courtyard on Shabbos, b'Shabbos, or all the other heirs that we're talking about on Shabbos, they had no options anyhow. So my klach etza yafazika, for sure the non-Jew had no interest, they didn't really necessarily care about the Eruv at the onset of Shabbos. He's not a part of it anyhow. And now he died on Shabbos, and all of a sudden it's retroactive that he relinquished his rights. That's not, that can't be the reason. So Ella, so rather, Abaye explains that there's a different reason here. The Beis Shammai salary bitul reshus mikni reshusahi. Beis Shammai says that when you relinquish rights, you actually are bequeathing the rights of your land to your neighbors. So that's a transaction. That's a mekach or memkar. That's selling and buying on Shabbos, and that you can't do. However, Beis Hillel Savri is Taluki Rishus B'Alma. Beis Hillel hold, no, you're not actually making you're not bequeathing, you're not making any mekach or memkar acquisitions. Rather, you're just retreating, you're relinquishing your rights and leaving it there, sort of like a hefker, and that's and to do that on Shabbos is permissible. There's a question in the Rishonim whether this is similar to hefker or it's different than hefker. And there's a concept of bittul rishus, which what we're talking about, and that the Ramban says that's different than hefker. The term hefker usually means where you're actively releasing your land, making it ownerless, and that's that the Ramban says as a form of acquisition or a bequeathing, whereas the Me'irim and the others say no, it's not, and it would be permissible even to do a hefker on Shabbos. The bittul over here is slightly different. It's not really a full hefker, but rather you're just you're nullifying your ownership, which is a little bit different and less active. Either way, this is allowed to be done on Shabbos, and that's the distinction. Beis Shammai says it's an actual bequeathing to the group, and therefore that's mekach or memkar. You're gifting, as it were, your rights in the courtyard to the neighbors, and that's commerce. Beis Hillel say no, you're just releasing your own, you're negating your own ownership, and it automatically becomes theirs, and that's permissible. Back to the way an Eruv is made. The next mission is going to talk about the food, that the partnership that's needed. So we'll see that in order to make an Eruv in a courtyard, you need a bread. In order to make an Eruv, which is called a shituf, a partnership, in an alleyway, you can use other foods. This fellow has a partnership with his neighbors in a barrel of wine, already prior to the onset of Shabbos. They have nothing to do with an Eruv. They have a partnership. They bought a barrel of wine together, they made wine together, whatever it is, and they have a partnership. Does that count as an Eruv or not? A homeowner who is a partner with another two of the homeowners in a barrel of wine. They don't need to make an Eruv. The partnership they have in advance, without the intent of Eruv, works as a partnership for the meal. It's essential a meal and counts as an Eruv. However, if one of them he's a partner with in a barrel of wine, and one he's a partner in a barrel of oil, then they do have to make an eruv. It's not going to be valid by just having these, because they're two different foods in two different barrels. Yeah. So one of them is with oil, one of them is with wine. It's not going to be. Reb Shimon, however, Reb Shimon says, Reb Shimon says, no, regardless of whether it's partners in a barrel of wine or partners in in a barrel of wine and a barrel of oil, either way, you don't have to make an eruv. That counts. Amar Rav. So the Gemara says that Rav explains, Ube Kli Echad. The barrel is a single barrel of wine. It's not one barrel. He's a partner with one neighbor in one alleyway or one courtyard, and with another courtyard, he's a partner in a different barrel of wine. That's going to be two partnerships, and will not unify them. Even though that we saw earlier that that if everybody fills a basket, right? Everybody's putting their breads in to the eruv, and it overflows, so they put it into a second basket. That's going to be valid. That's going to be valid because you filled one basket and it's overflow into another basket. But over here, if you have a different partnership, one barrel of wine with one group and one barrel of wine with the other, it's going to be invalid. So Amar Rava Dekanami. Rava says, indeed, the Brisa seems this way. The Mishnah seems this way. It says that if this one has wine and this one has oil, it's not going to count as an eruv, right? That they have to make a new eruv, and it's not going to count as an eruv. Why did they switch to wine and oil? Just say if it's in two separate barrels, right? It's iamas b'shlam reisha b'kli echad v'sefer kol yisheni shaper. So if you say the first part's in one barrel and the second is in two barrels, that makes sense. What the distinction? Eliamas reisha b'shnei kelim. But if you say the beginning already is talking about two barrels, the sefer b'shnei kelim, and the second is talking about two barrels, maliyayin v'yayin maliyayin b'shemen. What's the distinction between wine and oil or wine and wine? Either way, it's in two barrels. For sure, the oil's in two barrels. The Gemara understands at this point, and so if the reisha is also in two barrels, so what's the distinction? Must be that the distinction is in the first part, it's all in one barrel, a single barrel of wine, and that's why that's going to count as a good eruv for all of the courtyards and the alleyways in the courtyard, because they're all partners in the wine. And the second is a separate barrel for wine and a separate for oil, and that's why it's not going to work. No, maybe perhaps the distinction is really they're both in two barrels, and he's got a barrel that he's in a partnership with the courtyard number one, and another barrel that he's in partnership with the members of courtyard number three, and he's in courtyard number two, and they're all partners in wine. And the reason it counts, even though it's in two barrels, is on account of that they could be mixed, they could be unified, because it's all wine. Whereas when it's a separate oil barrel and a separate wine barrel, now those can't actually be mixed, and therefore it's not a unified eruv. The Gemara says the next part of the Mishnah was that Rabbi Shimon either way, they do not need to make a new eruv. It works even though that it's in two barrels. So the Gemara says, even though that he's a partner with one alleyway, or with one courtyard with a barrel of wine, and one courtyard he's in a partnership with a barrel of oil. How could that be? Why would that be a good eruv? They don't mix. What's talking about is that there are two alleyways that are separate alleyways, and the members of the outer sides of both of the alleyways are really not making an eruv with each other, but rather each are making an eruv with the middle courtyard, which is open to both alleyways. It's open to the alleyway on the west and the alleyway on the east, and so this middle courtyard, which is open to both alleyways, is making an eruv on its west side with the alley with the other the courtyards on the other side of the alley, and on the east side with the courtyards on the other side of the alley. And with one, they're partnering, they're partners with wine, and with one, they're partners with oil. And that's how they're really two separate things. And we're not trying to get the members of the outer courtyards to be in an eruv with each other. Just the middle one has to be in a valid eruv with each one. Rabbi Shimon Latame, and this is Rabbi Shimon, according to his opinion, which we saw this earlier already. That Rabbi Shimon said that Tanan, Amar Rabbi Shimon said, this is in the case of people who set their eruv outside of the city, and they're within they're each one in their own space, but each space overlaps with the middle, but the two outers don't overlap. So similarly to Rabbi Shimon says, what's it similar to? 3 courtyards. Each one of the courtyards are open to each other, as well as open to the street, to the public domain. Now, they could all 3 make an eruv together because they're all open to each other, but they didn't. What they did was the farthest east courtyard made an eruv with the middle, and the farthest west made an eruv with the middle. But the 2 farthest ends did not make an eruv with each other. Both of the outer ones made an eruv with the middle one. So therefore, the middle one can carry into either of the outside courtyards. And either of the outside courtyards can carry into the middle courtyard. However, the 2 outer courtyards cannot carry to each other. They're not allowed to be in an eruv with each other. So Abai says, how can you compare those cases? There, it clearly says that the 2 outer ones may not carry to each other. They can only carry into the middle. So I understand that we're talking about that the outer ones made an eruv with the middle, and the middle made an eruv with the outer ones, but the outer ones didn't make an eruv with each other. But in our Mishnah, there's no such comparison. There's no such distinction. The Mishnah does not say that the outer ones can't make an eruv with each other, and only the middle can make an eruv with the outer ones. And where he says that they're partners in barrels of wine and barrels of oil, and they can make an eruv with each other. It really says lazu, and it doesn't make a distinction and say, oh, they can all carry with the one who has possession of the barrels, but they can't carry to each other. Over here it says they don't need an eruv, period, meaning they can all carry without a problem. So the Gemara says, it just means that they don't need to make an eruv with the middle property that is housing the wine and housing the oil and is a connector to each one of these alleyways. But the other members of the alleyways cannot carry into the to the opposite alley. But you still would need an eruv from the courtyards, the far east and the far west of these alleyways, that they would have to make an eruv with each other. Now we turn to Ayin Aleph on the base. Rabbi Yosef, however, Rabbi Yosef Amar, he says, Rabbi Shimon v'Rabbanan plukta Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri v'Rabbanan. That Rabbi Shimon and the Rabbanan, they're arguing in a machlokes of Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri and the Rabbanan. And really, we're just talking about in a regular alleyway, a single alleyway with just multiple homes in there. And these barrels are in partnership with other members of the alleyway. And the basis of the machlokes is Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri and the Rabbanan, the Tanan. And here's a new concept. And the change that's going on here, according to Rav Yosef, is that whereas up until now we were understanding it's all in separate barrels, now even the oil and wine are going to be in a single barrel. And the question is that now we learned shemen shetzaf al gabe yayin, oil that's floating on top of wine. So you have teruma oil and teruma wine, and obviously they don't mix. So you have the oil at the bottom and wine at the top. V'naga tevul yom b'shemen, and a tevul yom touches the oils. So a tevul yom is someone who became certain tumas that have, all tumas, you have to go to the mikveh, and then you could be tummy until the evening. Sometimes you even tummy till the next day because you need a carbon. So somebody who already went to the mikveh, but the sun has not set, or mechusah kippurim, someone who requires, the sun has set, but they still require a carbon. So this tevul yom, someone who went to mikveh that day, is already tahor to a degree, but in regards to certain things, he's still tummy. And the halacha is that if he touches teruma, it invalidates the teruma. So he touched the oil and not the wine. It only invalidates the oil because they're separate, and so they don't mix, and so the teruma of the wine never got touched and never became tummy. However, Rabbi Yochanan says, no, they do count as a connected unit, and when the tevul yom touches the oil or the wine, the other also becomes tummy, also becomes puzzle invalid. So we see that there is a machlokas of whether or not they can constitute as a single entity, a single unit, or not. And therefore, according to Rabbi Yochanan that says that they do count as a single entity, so then the two neighbors could, one is a partner in the oil and one is a partner in the wine, are in a single entity and count as a joint eruv. Whereas, according to the Chachamim, we say that it does not invalidate the teruma of the other, meaning that the oil and the wine, even if they're one on top of the other, will not count as a single entity. And just as it doesn't count as a single entity in regards to tuma, it will not count as a single entity in the partnership over here. And we don't have all members of the alleyway in one single eruv unit. So Rabbanan, Karabanan, Rabbi Shimon, Rabbi Yochanan. Tanya, Rabbi Elazar ben Tadai, now we have another explanation. Rabbi Elazar ben Tadai, he has a third opinion entirely. And he says, whereas in our Mishnah we said two partnerships in wine is going to count as a valid eruv. A wine and oil will not count as a valid eruv because they're not all joined together. And Rabbi Shimon says, no, it does count as an eruv. They are joined together, either as we saw in the unique case of where they're in separate alleyways, and this is the sort of joining situation, or that we explain that the oil and wine constitutes something that's connected. Now we have Elazar Tadai. He says actually even in wine, it's not going to count as a good eruv. You're going to need a separate eruv made, and the wine in the two barrels won't count. Amar Rabba. So Rabbi said, if everybody brings their lug, their jug of oil, and dump it into their jug of wine, and they jump it into a barrel of wine, and they make a blend by everybody just bringing their wine and putting it in. Of course, everybody's a member of this eruv on account of that they each put in some wine. But rather, the question is, were they purchased wine as a partnership? Rabbi Elazar ben Tadai Sava ein Bereira. Rabbi Elazar ben Tadai says there's no retroactive definition of saying which is mine and which is yours, and therefore Bereira won't work here. Whether this is the same concept of Bereira that we always say or not, because it's not really so retroactive. Either way, the concept is you cannot say, oh, we purchased a barrel of wine together, so you've put in some and I've put in some and he's put in some, and therefore we're all partners in it, and it's not going to be a valid eruv. V'Rabbana Savri Yesh Bereira, and the Rabbana say no, that does count as each individual having defined space within the barrel. and therefore each one is a partner in the barrel and partner in the Eruv, and it works as having a joint meal. Rav Yosef Amar, however, Rav Yosef explains different than Rabbah. It's not this Breira issue, but rather Rabbi Lezer v'Tadai Rabbanan b'Simchin al Shituv b'Mokem Eruv Kamipalgi. Rather, the question is, can you rely on a shituv, on a partnership in an alleyway, in the place of an Eruv? That means, up until now, we were talking about a courtyard, which there everybody puts in a joint meal, putting in a bread, and that's called Eruve Chatzeros, courtyards that are now becoming unified, mixed. Then there are multiple courtyards in an alleyway, and when they make a partnership, it's called Shitufei Mavos, a partnership within the Mavoi, within the alleyway. And so now the question is this: if people join in an alleyway, even Rabbi Elizabeth Tadai agrees that's a valid partnership with a barrel of wine. However, the problem is, the question is that when you make an Eruv in an alleyway, which we call Shitufei Mavos, a partnership in a Mavoi, in an alleyway, is that sufficient for the courtyards as well? Since everybody is a member of the alleyway, so then all the courtyards are combined as well. Or do we say, no, that's not going to count as a valid Eruv on account of that you need one partnership for the alleyway, and the courtyard itself is also going to need its own Eruv, and you cannot rely on the alleyway's joint meal, which we're going to call Shitufei Mavos, the partnership in the Mavo, and that's not going to be sufficient for your Chatzir. That's what Rabbi Elazar Tadai says, and that's why they still need an Eruv. That's all he means. He means even though you've made a valid valid alleyway partnership, a Shitufei Mavos, you still are going to need an Eruv Chatzeros, a courtyard Eruv. The Marasova in Semchen, once that Elizabeth Tadai says you can't rely on the alleyway, you need a courtyard Eruv as well. Marasova Semchen. Amar Rav Yosef min Aminil. So Rav Yosef said, how do I know that this is the reasoning? The Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Rav, halachika Rabbi Meir. Rav Yehuda said in the name of Rav, the halacha is like Rabbi Meir, who holds that you cannot rely on the alleyways partnership. You also need a courtyard partnership. You need a Eruv Chatzeros. V'Amar Abruna Amar Rav, halachika Rabbi Elazar ben Tadai. And in the name of Rav Bruna said that Allah is like Rabbi Elazar ben Tadai. My time. Why did he say that Allah is like him? La mishum dechad taimi. Wouldn't you say it's all based on the same reasoning? So he said, well, then why does Rav need to say that Allah is like Rabbi Meir and Allah like Rabbi Elazar ben Tadai? Just say that Allah is like one, and we know this if they're all based on the same reasoning. Hakamashma says, no, it's teaching us the le'avdin and katrei chumri be'eruvin, that you don't do a chumrah on both ends. Yeah, and since and Rav said that Allah is like Rabbi Meir and Allah is like Rabbi Elazar ben Tadai, to tell you that you're not going to be strict on both ends. And Rabbi Meir holds that you can't rely on the mavoi if you partnered with bread, which we said that that really bread only works in the alleyway. In a courtyard, not in the alleyway. Could you have bread, but could also have wine? And there, Rabbi Meir says, regardless of whether you used bread for the alleyway or you used wine for the alleyway, you cannot rely on the Eruv. And we'll continue with this. We're out of time, so we'll continue with Rabbi Meir, that this idea that you cannot rely on an alleyway partnership when you participate in an Eruv, and you need a separate Eruv for your alley for your courtyard besides for the partnership in the alley.